Uh, Kalpana, can I also very quickly tell you that what we have done so far as a
Of
recap of
course.
what
Yes,
is it that
please,
you are part
please.
of?
Yes.
As I told you, this is the fifth in the, you are the fifth speaker in the series. The idea, of course, was to kind of, bring together, scholars, activists, practitioners in the field of labor, migration, and all the intersectional areas, so that we can, of course, I think we have a very young team, so the team can learn, what is a kind of, what's happening around us, and also we will be able to showcase to the larger world, issues of contemporary significance and policy relevance, even otherwise, the new knowledge and things like that. So the first lecture was, as I told you, in November 2023, where we invited a young professor of anthropology from Jahangirnagar University, Mahmoud Al-Sumoon. He talked on the kind of aftermath of, the infamous Tazreen and Rana Plaza fire accidents. And he was really asking, how the entire labor administration and the safety sort of, narrative has shifted post that huge and very tragic industrial sort of an accident. And the second lecture was by Alessandra Misadri, as you know, from SOAS. We were particularly because her work in very specifically on migration, women, garment, etc., we thought was very important for us and others to get to know. She talked about labor and migration in the GPN, Global Production Network. Largely, it was a kind of a lecture where she has really sort of put together the insights that she has so far gathered from her very rich work in the garment sector. That was followed by Professor Mary John's presentation on, again, a very, very interesting topic where she said that marriage is work. I think largely she was sort of, unraveling how marriage has very different implications for women's and men's work. And she has also linked it with child marriage, early marriage, and things like that, through which she was actually kind of a very interesting discourse on, how marriage becomes a kind of a central piece for women. We have a lot of debates around women's decreasing participation in the workforce and all that, but for 85% of the women, marriage is work, or marriage means that's only option of work. And I think that was a very interesting sort of a presentation. And the last one was by Karuna Dietrich Velinga. Of course, she again brought her kind of field experiences from South in Tamil Nadu. But she was generally discussing a kind of a historical trajectory of, informality and informal work in India. And I think more than a kind of a narrative of that nature, she was actually trying to say that how informality continued through time. So it's not something as many say neoliberal policies have been responsible for, sort of, informality and things like that. In between, we also had a kind of a joint presentation of one of our work, with slightly different format, wherein kind of there was a paper on worksite housing that one of our researchers was earlier working with us. So we had a presentation based on that too. That was a slightly different format with discussions by 2, 3 scholars, and he's a younger scholar. So this is broadly what we have been able to organize so far. Our idea was to have a talk every month, which is often not possible because it's not very easy to get scholars to come and talk to us. But I think this has been a very interesting sort of what do you call it, kind of a journey, and I think we have been a very interesting set of material which can really constitute a wonderful book. If you really look at it that way, the kind of individual contribution. So, one of the areas that we have been quite keen to have was actually in mobilization, organization of informal workers. I personally was telling you, like, this is an area that we are interested in, and I think that's an area which is becoming increasingly relevant in the labor action space in general. especially we don't really see informality to go down in any way, though we have talks about formalization of work, etc. And we are seeing newer and newer sites becoming informal, even the earlier formal space turning to informal in terms of relationship and all that. So I think then how can we sort of, how can we have a strategy of kind of including them in the larger mobilization sort of story of workers. So I'm extremely happy, Kalpana, that you have agreed to speak to us, and I'm sure that you are going to build on many of these. If I really look at some of these topics, and from what I understood as you are going to present today, the interrogation that you are planning today of how these strategies and forms of kind of mobilizing, organizing, collectivizing informal workers changed over time in response to what are the triggers and how it has shifted form and content would be absolutely wonderful, and with very very warm sort of a welcome to you. And I think the floor is yours. The general format is that you will speak for about maybe 30 minutes, 35 minutes to optimize
Sure, sure.
because
Time for
and
interactions.
then then we have question
Yeah,
etc. and have a more open discussion.
absolutely.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you so much. That very warm welcome. It's truly my pleasure, my honor to be speaking to your group today. And I think you reached out to me this summer when I was traveling, and I was delighted then, and I'm equally delighted now to be part of this lecture series that you have put together so brilliantly. My theme today is workers' struggles and campaigns in the informal sector with a focus on women workers and a regional focus on Tamil Nadu, and it's called Refusing Simple Binaries. So as part of this uh, talk today, I will be addressing a set of questions which I want to foreground right at the beginning in order to keep us anchored. I won't be using a PPT. I just haven't prepared a PPT, and I somehow thought it wasn't required. But if you're feeling lost at any point of time, please feel free to let me know, and I can always sort of sum up where I need to, etc. So the questions really that I want to foreground is, I am looking at, as I said, women workers largely in collective mobilization for basic entitlements and rights, all manual workers in the lower tiers, lower end of the informal sector. My questions are going to be, where are their struggles focused? Are the struggles and campaigns that they are initiating, are they workplace centered, such as, say, claims around working conditions and wages directed at, obviously, employers? Or alternatively, are these largely social security and social protection centered and directed at the state? And as some scholars argue, there has been a discernible move away, or this is the argument, the claim, that there has been a discernible move away from demanding workplace rights vis-a-vis employers and towards informal workers demanding social security, pensions, health insurance, educational scholarships for workers' children, etc. So essentially, it is social citizenship centered rights that are being asserted and claimed. And again, this is part of the larger argument that I'm tracing, that the modes and strategies of union activism have also shifted, it is argued, moving away from geraus, lockouts, strikes, pickets, and the stoppage of work, right, to more developmental modes of activism, such as, say, maybe skill enhancing of workers or forming workers' cooperatives. So to put it maybe somewhat crudely, moving away from an era of struggle to development or development-based activism, and moving away from fighting to building, right? I'm picking up these words from the literature. Or less confrontational and less agitational modes of organizing workers. Now, this is the claim that is being made. And of course, the argument is that production structures are changing and are at the root of this, formal to informal work and non-standard employment. So therefore, modes of employment tend to be contractual, temporary, contingent, and casual. Very often home-based, and production enters the homes. And when production enters homes, it is women who become the ideal and sought after workforce, and women and workers cannot therefore risk everything by stopping work or by resorting to strikes, because there is no statutory job protection anymore. And this is particularly the case again with women workers in the informal sector, where often subcontracting arrangements mean that women are working in neighborhoods tucked away, and there is no clear employer, or they're just self-employed, right? So there is no employer at all, right? So this is the larger picture, the storyline, etc. Now, my study, largely based in Tamil Nadu, includes workers who are both wage-employed and self-employed. Wage-employed workers are construction workers, women and men, from a union, one of whose members is here with us today, the Kattida Tholilalar Panchayat Sangam in Tamil Nadu. Domestic workers, largely, of course, women. Salt pan workers, both men and women. So these are the wage-employed. And also self-employed workers who are flower sellers, fruit sellers, fish sellers, and those who are home-based workers, as well as home-based cook, who sell and prepare and sell home-based cooked food and snacks, and home-based tailors, right? And mostly women. The trade unions who organize them, and I contacted primarily the trade unions. The trade unions are both autonomous and affiliated to left political parties. But all unions of my study worked with a larger vision of transformative change in the direction of social and economic justice. And just to clarify, these are all membership subscription-based unions. So membership subscription is the primary source of funding for the union. Traditional customs and delicious cuisine. I think somebody had their, yeah, that's.
Someone has kept the mic on. Could you please, if Anurag can mute everybody, that'd be wonderful. Otherwise, I request everyone to mute themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are not funded organizations. Therefore, in a sense, there is downward accountability. They pick up cues on which issues to prioritize based on the expressed priorities of their constituents, their workers. Now, the larger framework that generally guides my research is that what women of working poor households do, how they organize, and what forms their mobilizing takes will be shaped necessarily by what state and capital do or do not do, and how state and capital are themselves transforming over time. And I think this is borrowing from a lot of literature. So, for instance, just once again to frame my study, David Harvey, the Marxist scholar, is known for his theorizing of accumulation, what he calls accumulation by dispossession, essentially capital accumulation that primarily takes place through the privatization of land and the forceful expulsion of peasant population, if it is the countryside, and conversion of various kinds of property rights, state-owned, communal, collective property rights into exclusive private property, exclusive forms of private property, right? So, capital then is spatially reconfiguring cities and the countryside. And in cities, this takes the form of what we are familiar with, which is slum evictions in densely populated urban centers. Right. And in cities, we see this in all our cities in India, class differentiation has been growing within civil society since liberalization and the associated reforms in 1991. And eviction of the poor we see is an outcome of growing land markets. Housing sites are offered as compensation in the distant peripheries of cities as part of schemes such as the JNNURM, or the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, but these are all in far-flung peripheries of cities. And simultaneously, there is a governmental reluctance to invest resources in improving basic infrastructure and amenities in slums inside cities, right? So, here is the first sort of agenda of action of all the trade unions that were part of this study, which was battling evictions and defending land. For instance, the Pen Tholilalar Sangam, which was formed in 2000, is a union largely of domestic workers, women domestic workers, and one of their critical sites of action has been launching multiple local battles to stall slum evictions, even courting arrest on several occasions, as they realized any relocation from the city would be disastrous to the livelihoods of their women workers. Domestic workers spent months commuting to the city after relocation to the homes of their former employers. They would leave very early, taking their young children with them, as they could not find jobs locally due to issues of trust. The prospective employers would ask for letters of recommendation, which often they were not able to provide. And women domestic workers would then drop out of the paid workforce over a period of time as they were unable to sustain these long commutes. And we must remember that the location of the slum next door to the middle, almost next door to the middle and the upper middle class housing is a hallmark of the stratified uneven development that we see in our cities, right? And it's not easily found elsewhere. And we therefore must keep in mind here women's limited mobility because of the burden of care labor and household labor, which means that they cannot alienate and commodify, cannot alienate and sell their labor power as men are able to. So they're not free to sell their labor power like men are. And so the right to residence in the heart of the city and the right to livelihoods are interconnected, generally for the urban poor, but more so in the case of working poor women. And therefore, women's embeddedness within their neighborhoods gives them a strong reason to defend these neighborhoods. They have a real material stake in defending their right to occupy their land. And even before the Pen Tholilalar Sangam and its struggles in the 2000s, about 20 years earlier, in the 1980s, there was the Pen Urimai Yakkam, a women's organization, not a trade union, but a working class women's organization that was also part of this study. And in the 1980s, they had a series of valiant battles to retain their right to live in North Chennai. As their organizers said to me, and I'm quoting here, no slum would have remained in 72 habitations in North Chennai if not for us. So it was therefore through a massive resistance to slum evictions that Pennurima Iyakkam established a base for its women's sangams in these 72 residential areas. And then, of course, the organization went on to take up a number of other issues. So over the 1990s and the 2000s, the difference has been that it has become increasingly difficult to actually win these battles against the state, especially given the heterogeneity of urban poor residents. Tenants, not homeowners, have been more easily persuaded to move out of the city since they are given house pattas in their new locations. Plus, the state push, the will of the state, the administrative push to relocate slums outside the city has been that much stronger, right? So we move then from battling eviction and defending land to what are called area issues, right? This is the second area of action. So when it was not an outright eviction, there was a great need to make neighborhoods more livable and improve the quality of infrastructure, basic services, and civic amenities. Hence, all the unions of this study intervened proactively in area issues or area prachanai, right? And these were poor road maintenance, open drains, the intermixing of drinking water and sewage, garbage heaps that grew by the day, street lights that don't work, buses that don't stop in their locality, ration shops that were not meeting their needs, Anganwadi centers not functioning, etc. The reasons seem to be obvious. It is women who have to accompany family members to health centers if unsanitary living conditions bring disease. Their burden of unpaid care work within the household increases. And when water tankers, for instance, arrive late in their neighborhoods, domestic workers in turn show up late in their employers' homes, leading to tensions and even a threat to their jobs. So, as we know, and much of gender studies scholars have said this, the boundaries between the productive and reproductive domains of women's lives are blurred. And therefore, it was that women members of all these unions were organizing, protesting, petitioning, visiting the corporation office, doing the dharna, blocking the streets, keeping up the pressure until some form of resolution was reached with local authorities. As a local organizer of the Pen Toilalar Sangam, the Domestic Workers Union, said to me, this is why the women approach us in the first place. We build the idea of a trade union gradually and over a period of time. So what we see here, and we must recognize that we are seeing this, is that there is a blurring of boundaries between labor movement, what we might think of as labor movement mobilizing, and women's movement mobilizing, when the workers are largely women in the informal sector and the site of mobilization is the community. And just to reiterate, the branches of all these unions, construction workers, salt pan, self-employed women workers, domestic workers, were all based and built where the workers reside. This is where the trade union organizers meet with workers, hold their meetings, preliminary meetings, and initiate the branches of the unions. Another crucial area of action involved building workers' identities, right? And here, let me give you the example of the CITU, the labor union, the labor union affiliated to the CPIM. The CITU was also part of the study that earlier used to organize primarily male industrial workers in factories. In the 1970s, the big factory-based workers' action and strikes in what was then the city of Madras were led by the CITU. Since the mid to late 1990s, the CITU has vigorously unionized informal women workers in diverse occupations. So about 60% of its membership in Tamil Nadu comprises informal workers. The CITU has now had to tap into social networks and community ties in order to build its informal workers union of self-employed women in Chennai city. And how did it do this? The primary contact was usually a slightly better off woman in the neighborhood who carried out some form of petty trade activity and enjoyed some local influence. She would persuade women who worked as sweepers and roadside sellers in her locality to join the union. If she was a homeowner, it was likely that some of the other women were her tenants. So the primary agenda of the first neighborhood-based branch meetings, the early meetings of the union, was to convince the women that they must recognize and embrace their identities as workers, that their earnings fed and sustained their families. This is clearly a vital starting point from which to articulate interests and rights-based claims. A union organizer I interviewed had formerly worked for several years in the CITU's union for industrial workers, factory workers, and therefore had a keen sense of the differences between organizing women workers in the factory and women workers in the community. While informal women workers saw her as a family member who interacted with their husbands and children, women factory workers had seen her, perceived her, and related to her primarily as a union leader. In the CITU, neighborhood-based organizing took the unionists into women's homes, which meant intervening in cases of domestic assault and alcohol-fueled abuse of women and girls by male family members. It also involved counseling women against the early marriage of their daughters, or guiding the women on how to tackle broken marriages, or even the suicide attempts, love affairs, and elopements of their teenage, school, or college-going children. The union organizer was frequently called upon by the women workers to confront and threaten their drunk or abusive husbands unless they mended their ways. Here again, we see the blurred boundaries between the productive and reproductive domains of women's lives. When the man beats her, breaks pots and pans, causing a sleepless night and tension at home and a nuisance in the neighborhood, women workers are unable to leave early the next morning for work, whether it is to sell something in the streets or to perform domestic labor in somebody else's home. So and therefore I want you to see the union organizer as a family friend, counselor, and mediator, right? These are the multiple roles that the union organizer plays when mobilizing shifts to the neighborhood, and large numbers of workers are informally employed women workers. Apart from being a valued family friend and counselor, union organizers also played the role of mediation with informal lenders and financiers, essentially by standing up to cases of extortion and the verbal harassment and abuse that follows usually such extortion. In these instances, the CITU would escalate the matter to the police, making it clear to the police and to the informal lender that their union stood by the woman borrower and her family. None of the unions of this study directly provided microfinance services, but they did nevertheless keep a watchful eye on local money lenders and intervened when called upon to do so. So I would now like to move to workplace and work-centered rights, right? Looking at the action in this dimension. So besides area issues, battling eviction, building the identities of workers as workers, etc., the unions also organized around workplace and work-centered rights. For the domestic workers union, this took the form of intensive training over several sessions, training of their women workers on how to negotiate a better deal for themselves with their middle-class employers. This would mean organizing meetings in the slum, in the low-income neighborhood, bringing together domestic workers, working in a big apartment complex. Often they would not know each other or know each other's names, so they would then come together in these union meetings, building trust and solidarity amongst the workers, finding out about each other's wages, right? So trusting the other worker enough to let her know what your wage is, and then learning slowly through this process of solidarity building and collective deliberation, learning to not undercut each other when bargaining with employers, right? And this also meant training on how to ask for an hourly wage depending on a wage card that would help them determine wages in an area, weekly leave, 1 day off in a week, an annual bonus of 1 month's salary in a year, and of course, insisting on dignity of treatment, refusing to eat stale food or the cold leftovers, refusing to take verbal abuse and humiliating language, and safety from sexual harassment in the places where they worked. So much for the domestic workers union and workplace and work-centered rights. I turn next to the salt pan workers, the Tamil Nadu Manual Workers Union, which mobilized workers in the men and women workers in Marakkanam, a coastal area, coastal panchayat in Viduppuram district of Tamil Nadu, right? The salt pans here are owned by the Central Salt Commission, but the production of salt is leased out to private companies, who in turn subcontract agents, as they are called, and the agents in turn use brokers, locally known as the Kangani. That is the word. So the Kangani recruits, supervises, and pays the workers. Each Kangani recruits about 200 workers who are mostly hired as families, so men and women workers. The union in this case, the Tamil Nadu Manual Workers Union, faced the challenge of whom to hold accountable when there are layers of intermediaries, right? They felt it was futile to approach the leaseholding private companies who could very easily shirk responsibility. The state government also refused responsibility in this case because the land was outside its jurisdiction. It was owned by the Central Salt Commission. And therefore, their petitions and demonstrations were all directed to the Central Salt Commission with its headquarters in Chennai, the Viluppuram District Collectorate, and the Marakkanam Town Panchayat. Their demands were a combination of workplace and welfare rights, equally, not one to the exclusion of the other, except that in this case, all these demands were directed at the state because of this layer of intermediaries. Their workplace demands included the provision of drinking water in summer in the salt pans where workers were drinking salt water to quench their thirst, provision of a creche for infants and small children, a resting room for workers, toilets in the salt pan, and mobile clinics, because in the scorching heat, when there was heat strokes and dehydration of workers, there was often no form of first aid or medical attention available nearby. The union also emphasized the demand of protecting their livelihoods because of the need to regulate prawn farms in the vicinity. Wastewater from the prawn farms would ruin the salt pans. And therefore, that became a central demand placed by the unions. The welfare rights included an unemployment insurance during the monsoon, housing support for the impoverished workers, all of whom were Dalit workers, and educational support for the workers' children, right? So I move next to social protection, what we can call social. I mean, there were already several instances of social protection, but here in this section, I'm going to focus specifically on how all the unions of this study had to battle with the welfare boards. And I here want to give you a little bit of context. Like Kerala, Tamil Nadu has been a pioneer state in the formation of the unorganized workers' welfare boards. It has implemented, these boards supposedly implement a whole slew of welfare schemes. These include the old age pension for workers, an accident insurance, maternity benefits, educational support for the children of workers, marriage-related financial assistance, disability benefit, among a host of other schemes. In 1994, the first construction workers board was created in the first welfare board. The unorganized sector workers welfare board was created in Tamil Nadu as an outcome of a long struggle launched by construction workers in the state. And therefore, it was a construction workers welfare board. The most recent welfare boards were created last year, 2023, for salt pan workers and gig workers. So Tamil Nadu currently has about 18 worker welfare boards directly under the Labour Department and 18 under various state government departments. Since the 1990s, the trade unions of this study have used the formation of the worker welfare boards to mobilize and unionize and thus extend their presence amongst informal sector workers. They have motivated workers to join the trade union and simultaneously register themselves with the welfare boards, right? So it's like they enter neighborhoods, motivate workers to register both with the trade union and with the welfare boards. And I found that at least 50% of the time and energies of trade unions, if not more, was devoted to wrestling with the welfare boards. First, to register the workers as members, as board members, welfare board members, and then to secure the benefits for them under each of these schemes, depending on which schemes they were eligible for. As a CITU unionist said, this is hard work as we have to go and look for workers in their neighborhoods, right? Even if this entire procedure has become online post-COVID, however, the workers, as we know, are not concentrated in factories and workshops, and it is meant, therefore, locating the workers in the dispersed neighborhoods in which they live, right? So the formation of the welfare boards and the proactive outreach of the unions, of the trade unions, has encouraged, no doubt, women workers to see themselves as workers deserving of dignity, rights, and recognition by the state. And arguably, this symbolic recognition by the state of their identities as workers may have been greater than the actual financial benefits secured through the range of these schemes. The reason is that resource allocation the budgets for the welfare boards have been very low overall, and even more so when you see it in relation to the demand for such resources, right? There is therefore, the welfare boards clearly feel a need to ration out applications from the workers. They just can't meet the sheer volume of this demand. And this has led to the rejection of workers' petitions on arbitrary grounds. What this means is, in a local union branch of, say, 20 workers, if 5 to 7 workers get the benefits they apply for, but the others do not, this is demoralizing. And this fragments solidarities that the trade union has struggled so hard to build. And this is even more demoralizing if the grassroots organizer of the union, herself a worker from the neighborhood, does not get her own benefit, her own welfare benefit sanctioned. So here I think what we need to note is that unlike workplace benefits or an improvement in working conditions that impact all workers, the welfare benefit is individual worker oriented, right? Or targeted by its very nature. And workers have therefore over a period of time come to see the trade union as an intermediary who should efficiently mediate between them and the state bureaucracy, whether it's the labor office, the revenue department, or the welfare offices. When the trade unions fail to secure welfare benefits, despite their best efforts, they are seen as failed intermediaries. And the anger and frustration of the workers turns against the trade unions and not the board or not the welfare boards or the state, right? All the unions of this study, whether they were party affiliated or the autonomous unions, see and define the welfare boards as a knife that has to be a double-edged weapon, a knife that has to be wielded carefully and can hurt the labor movement and particularly hurt trade unions who are wedded to a vision of social change. This is because there is often competition from a large number of NGOs, right? They are colloquially called the letter pad NGOs. Basically, they really only exist primarily to secure welfare benefits for the workers and to be that kind of intermediary between the welfare boards and the workers. And they have absolutely no interest in the political education or consciousness raising of workers. In this context, the trade unions have to convince workers that the welfare boards were the fruit of an older generation of worker struggles. And therefore, we cannot afford to give up on the welfare boards in frustration. They are, in a sense, a child of the labor movement, right? So I'm going to move on then to, I think this sort of gives you a sense, a picture of the various areas, the various fronts in which the labor unions of this study have been pitching their battles. But I'm going to now move on to some observations and questions, I think, that this raises for us. And I'm going to return to what I said earlier at the beginning when I started, which is that we must attend to what state and capital are doing. In the age of neoliberal capitalism, what this has meant is, and scholars have noted this, the political scientist, Partha Chatterjee, amongst some others who have noted this, that the state cannot completely abandon the poor and leave them entirely to the mercies of a market economy, and definitely not in an electoral democracy. So in India, therefore, there has been an extension of social protection or social security or welfare-oriented measures that aim to mitigate or contain the effects of what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, right? Now, whether they do so effectively is another matter, and I'm not examining that now, but this is part of the intent, right? The welfare boards for informal sector workers are certainly part of this move. In Tamil Nadu, social protection has emerged, therefore, as a key arena of claims making and a key site of mobilizing, given the proliferation of the unorganized worker welfare boards. Besides welfare boards, other welfare initiatives in Tamil Nadu, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are also part of the social justice definition of the state, the self-definition of the state, with both the DMK and the AIADMK state governments in Tamil Nadu over the decades engaging in this competitive populism, if we want to use that word, which is to appeal to workers, to unorganized sections of the working population of Tamil Nadu, primarily through these measures. However, the actual organizing, the welfare claims organizing, has complex implications for building worker solidarities and presents trade unions with dilemmas that are not easily resolvable. Simultaneously, it is a huge opportunity to work among and mobilize sections of women workers, but also women workers, hitherto not organized. So I just want to lay this out for you. And I must also say that I did not see a discernible shift away from workplace-centered mobilizing and towards social protection. I did not see evidence of such a clear-cut shift. The picture that emerges is more layered. It's not either workplace-centered or welfare-oriented. In fact, I would also say that more agitational and confrontational tactics and modes of struggle have not gone away, have not disappeared with the emergence of welfare politics. The sites may have changed. So, for instance, the CITU informal workers' unions found it necessary to display periodic strength, to a periodic display of strength through mass protests, ghettos, and demonstrations, but now before the welfare offices and the district labor offices that disburse the welfare benefits. And we, of course, also saw women workers, the domestic workers, construction workers, self-employed workers, resistance to slum evictions emerge as a crucial form that collective actions by their unions take in the neighborhoods. And this clearly is a work issue. This is a workplace issue, since defending their right to employment is also defending their right to stay in the workforce. The right to residence is also a right to work for women workers, and we mustn't lose sight of this. By way of concluding comments, I also want to relate what I have described now and what I have seen through my work with the labor unions, with what I have done earlier, my older research, my older work with the women's self-help groups, the microcredit, microfinance centered self-help groups of Tamil Nadu. I had found from the mid-2000s or perhaps from the late 2000s that the self-help groups were increasingly involved in struggles to make their neighborhoods more livable as well, right? Just as the unions of this study were doing. So it was women, for instance, who were leading and who were in the front lines on issues of land, defending their land, food, the public distribution system, water, making Anganwadis work, making health centers work, with men watching from the sidelines if they were present at all. And I suggest that we must be cautious about uncritically celebrating this as women's agency or women's assertion, though we see plenty of evidence of both agency and assertion, right? Because what is obviously driving this is the gender division of work, responsibilities, and roles, and the social construction of women as the primary agents responsible for household labor and care work. But what we must also see as part of this then is that through their collective action, through their petitioning, through their protests, women have been taking on the mantle of holding the welfare state accountable for delivering the services and amenities essential for the social reproduction of working class and working poor households, right? So I'm sort of wanting us to, drawing our attention to what we are seeing here, which is that the labor, effort, the energy, the time investment is overwhelmingly feminized, even when the issues at stake clearly concern everybody's well-being, right? And we also see this at play in the mixed sex unions, right? Some of these unions were unions of both men workers and women workers, as I had said in the beginning. For instance, in the salt pans, 75% of the union members are women. even though there are as many men in the workforce, of the salt pans. In all the 15 union branches, the local area-based union branches, the president and secretary were all women. So, and it is women who participate, who show up in all local struggles and protest action. As the union secretary of the Tamil Nadu Manual Workers Union said to me, if we expect 200 to show up, 175 are women and about 20 to 25 might be men. So what we see is men unwilling to invest the time and energy for public service of this kind, unwilling to sacrifice leisure time, not interested in this, what is very clearly unpaid work. As the CITUs, and I saw this also in the CITU Self-Employed Workers Union, in which men are also members, though in fewer numbers, but men are never in any position of responsibility in the union at the local levels. In fact, the word they used is the men escape the responsibility of branch leadership. Avanga escape ஆயிடுவாங்க. Men escape the responsibility, the word escape being used. So I guess that what I'm trying to present for you is a complex picture. But what does it mean for the women engaging in this form of collective action, right? That's a question we obviously must ask. As you can well imagine, there are several testimonies of personal growth and self-actualization. Women were conscious, especially the local women leaders, that they gain knowledge of the world outside the home. They gain the skills to negotiate and the self-confidence there is in when their social universe widens. They taste the power there is in mobilizing other women, the heady feeling that the state has to listen to you. Even the police is afraid of you. The corporation councillor then shows up when so many women are visibly protesting, even as they are aware that acquiring this involves real material costs. So let me quote Kalavati, an organizer of the Pennurima Yakkam, a fisher colony in South Chennai. And this is Kalavati's quote, open quotes. Once we decide on a course of action, we don't turn back. We know we can do it. When I act in the name of Pennurima Yakkam, I become the power of the organization. And I act very powerfully with the women by my side. If we cannot resolve an issue, we are ready to sit in the road and block traffic. In this area, women feel that if they come along with Kalavati Akka, there is no fear. She will take care of the situation. She will deal with the police. She knows how to do this. I mobilize 100 women and I take them to any meeting. But domestic workers have to give up a daily wage of rupees 100 to come for these meetings. And yet they are willing to set aside 3 to 4 hours for their sangam and come. I close the quotation here. So these are clearly real material trade-offs for the women concerned, for the women workers. And this is, I think, a complex picture. Any analysis must take into account this complexity and what it means for women to be the foot soldiers of this form of collective action. I think I'll end here. And how much time have I taken up, Tara?
Ma'am, you're on mute.
I hope there is some time.
I was wondering how much you have an account of the time, Anurag. I was so immersed in that speech, so in the lecture, so I
45.
did not 45. Okay,
45.
fine.
Okay. Oh, I took exactly 45 minutes, is it? Okay.
So we had about 15,
Yeah, yeah.
20 minutes for, but I think that was an absolutely inspiring sort of what do you call it, a presentation, Kalpana, because I thought beyond everything, like I am familiar with, the kind of, arguments that you have with respect to, the way in which women realize certain kind of, power to sort of, be and influence others through this kind of collective arrangements. But I thought you also presented a wonderful alternative to, or a wonderful explanation of how, the the questions that we generally ask about trade unions. And their role in this organized workers versus kind of informal sector workers. And of course, there is a lingering criticism that the mainstream trade unions are not interested in dealing with some of these fairly flexible, intractable issues of informal sector workers organizing, because they are more interested in working with organized workforce and and things like that. So I think what you presented was also a very interesting way to read, if at all that happens, why, and or if at all that happens, in which ways it's really happening. This welfare centric or developmental focused, social activism, how much of that. And I realize that a lot of that has to do with the region that we are talking about and the political vigor that region represents. I have other examples, maybe from Rajasthan or other, not even Rajasthan, maybe Gujarat, where how much of a you perhaps try at the system is so employer sort of facing that maybe we really do not have a sort of what do you call it, way forward. But this was an absolutely wonderful explanation, or wonderful alternative gaze on like what has been happening in the country with respect to organizing. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I thought it really opened a lot of interesting avenues. Though you have never used the term the political power of organization, or politics or political explicitly, I knew that you were really talking about power as operating through some of these structures, and how it really changes shapes and like fuels some of these some of these negotiations or whatever. I think because you have also had a mention of how the non-governmentization of some of these, labor mobilization happens over time. So since Ajivika Bureau is an NGO, legally speaking, but trying to really sort of try out multiple ways of dealing with the deficits that they see, or the violations of rights that they see in the field, that itself is a great learning opportunity. For instance, some of the work that we do with agricultural workers in Western India, it really has done everything: organizing, unionizing, as well as a conscientization, telling them, training them, trying to ask them, okay, you go and ask for kind of a shift to wage, kind of daily wage labor system, not this sharecropping kind of arrangements. So I think that there are very interesting experiments happening at this point in time, where, as you said, we really perhaps do not have a single suite of sort of strategies, by virtue of the fact that we have those very, very complicated, complex dilemmas in front of us. So I think these are the thoughts which really crossed my mind, saying that you have been able to, through your exposition, you are actually able to throw light on the complexities which are already there, and the need to have a more historically informed kind of framework, look at some of these kind of developments in the field and how we can do that. Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation, Kalpana. Maybe we can have subsequent sessions on taking some of those questions forward. I don't know whether there are any questions in the chat box.
Ma'am, Harshita has raised her hand, so maybe we can start off.
Right. Please. I think I'll tell Anurag, we can really go ahead with questions now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I think this was a great learning experience, as well as I think taking the case study of Tamil Nadu and building up from that really provided the key insights of the heterogeneity in the informal sector as well. I think one of the key points that ma'am touched upon was the regionalization of demand that's being created between the different informal working groups. And I wanted to just get ma'am's opinion on what would be the difference, like where we are seeing regionalization of demand to as small or a micro level as a neighborhood, versus the universalization and the conversation around centralization of development rights that we are seeing in terms of platforms like eShram coming in. How do we see the two meeting, given the difference in the very scale of what the demand and what is being given in the centralized platforms? And secondly, given that a lot around regionalization actually focuses on people who are either stationary or are, as you said, have trust within the community, and you stressed a lot about community. I wanted to inquire, what is the scenario like for migrant workers who are coming in the state, and their move towards mobilization of demands? I would really appreciate your insights on the two questions. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Let me begin with the migrant workers. So, migrant workers, especially from Orissa and from Andhra, have been a very large part of the construction sector workforce in the big cities of Tamil Nadu, especially cities like Coimbatore, certainly in Chennai, where it is sort of well known now that the large building contracts no longer use local labor, right? So the construction workers union that is part of this study has sort of had to sort of grapple with that, has had to struggle with that. And I think the way they responded to this was to essentially foreground. They have not been able to directly unionize and mobilize migrant workers, right? Migrant construction workers. One big difference is the difference of language. Many of the local union organizers do not speak Hindi. In fact, when I was interviewing them, they would say that we have been told we must learn Hindi, and that is on our agenda, but we never seem to find the time to do it. So language is very clearly constrained. And the other, of course, is that migrant construction workers are very, very closely guarded. They do not live in these neighborhoods, right? They don't. There are areas that are segregated. Sometimes they live in a place which is an extension of the building site if it's outside the city. But in any case, they are not residentially integrated within slums, right? They are marked off in certain areas, and then they are sort of very closely guarded there, and their links are primarily to the contract leader who brings them into the state for work. But they have, especially the Kattide Tholilalar Panchayat Sangam has conducted surveys. So what they've done is to perhaps use information politics, right? And foreground the human rights of migrant construction workers. And they were part of surveys which showed that sometimes children come with them, but there is absolutely no creche on the work site. There is gross underpayment of migrant workers. Children receive no schooling at all. There have been cases of sexual abuse of little girls who are children of the construction workers. So from essentially to try and push the Tamil Nadu state government to introduce a migrant workers bill in the state legislature that recognizes these issues and build a sort of a kind of, a consciousness about their rights as workers by emphasizing a human rights angle here rather than a direct union mobilizing, which has been very difficult for them to do. So I must say that. There was a couple of years ago a massive collapse of a building which killed a large number of construction workers, all of them from outside the state in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai. And that really, sort of shook up, let's say, public conscience as well. And the construction workers, Kattide Tholilalar Panchayat Sangam was on the scene right there. And they also used this to kind of also amongst their own workers, amongst their own rank and file union members to to sort of, reduce a certain hostility their workers, Tamil workers may have felt vis-a-vis construction migrant workers, right? As people who are taking away their jobs, but to kind of use this collapse and the loss of lives to say that these are our fellow workers and we must also absolutely reach out to them. Your other question was about regionalization. Maybe I could use the word, I'm not sure what exactly you mean by regionalization of demands. I don't know whether what you mean by that is that many of the mobilizing that I talked about, the issues were very local specific. I think you meant that, right? That they were sort of rooted in the neighborhoods, in the slums in which these unions were organizing and where the workers reside, right? That's what you meant.
Yeah.
So But even if they were, let's say, very specific to the neighborhoods, I think what I've also shown is that there is a pattern. You see what these demands are, you see what the claims are, right? That very often it is the services that are not working, the basic amenities, the basic infrastructure that is not working. And that in turn means that the women workers, whether they are construction or domestic workers or self-employed workers, cannot either remain in the workforce or cannot be effective workers in the workforce, right? So while they may seem to be very local specific, I think we do see a clear pattern emerge. We know what kinds of demands these are. These are the sort of demands that would, where the state would, where the investment of the state would actually help women perform their women's work, right? What we see as women's work. So we do clearly see that pattern. And in terms of they are essentially struggling to make their neighborhoods more livable, right? To improve the quality of services, to improve the quality of infrastructure. So even if these, but what is very local specific here, I would say, is the outcomes of these struggles, right? Obviously, do they win their battles? I'm not always sure that's the case. That depends obviously on the local strength, right? The strength of the mobilizing vis-a-vis their ability to get their local ward members and councillors, listen to their demands, etc. And so sometimes there are wins, sometimes there are losses. There is definitely a great deal of variation. There's fluctuation. But in terms of what these demands are, I think we do clearly see these patterns. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I go?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. That was a really insightful session. It was really nice how you presented it as a very complex picture. I just wanted to understand to what extent, just like examples from, say, the domestic workers union, to what extent has the union attempted to say regulate the or like increase the wage rate? I know you did mention that there were attempts to like discuss these salaries and make sure that there's some solidarity among the women to discuss these more clearly. But just like extending that to other sort of informal workplaces that are so fragmented, how do you make a wage also as like an important demand, increase in wages, or in that sense? I just wanted to understand
Yeah.
from you.
No, absolutely. It's a crucial challenge. You would find that in some neighborhoods and localities. So everything in a city like Chennai, and probably the case with other big cities as well, everything depends on location, right? There are parts of Chennai where the existing market rate for the monthly payment to domestic workers might be higher than what the union is even asking for, right? Because that's the market rate, that's the locality. In many neighborhoods of South Chennai, for instance, the more affluent sections of Chennai, where you have the upper middle classes reside, the market rate could be even higher. But there would be other parts of Chennai where it would be much lower. So here, then clearly this one wage fits all approach does not work, right? So they have a system by which they work out a wage card depending on what actually works. And the other thing I must also say is that in some parts of Chennai, again, not all parts of Chennai, domestic work is paid higher for, let's say, mothers who are domestic workers than the kind of salaries that their daughters with some college education are able to get when they work in small offices and shops, right, in the locality. And then it's a question of many of the young women and many of the mothers, for instance, the domestic workers feel that what is this? We are getting a wage that is higher than what our college educated girls are getting in the informal sector. And for them, of course, the informal sector is still small shops, petty offices, right? Where their daughters are sometimes standing from 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening and earning about whatever, 400, 500 rupees a day, and or even less. And their mothers say, but we make more money than that, right? So there are all these interesting ways in which I think the wage question plays out, especially in occupation like domestic work, where there is absolutely no sort of centralized, uniformly implemented wage. standard wage, so to speak.
Any other questions?
Ma'am, if there's nobody, I just wanted to ask.
Sure.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the session. I just wanted, so I remember we were discussing, I mean, there was this discussion around because of all this welfare benefit linkages and, you know, it failing for one worker, then that kind of becomes demoralizing for other workers. And then how they view a trade union as a failed intermediary between the state and, you know, the working people. So I've also seen that working in the field, we also have come across a lot of unions and even, you know, other NGOs that start off their work like this. It's mostly benefit linkages and, you know, like filling of forms so that they can become part of that board and, you know, so on and so forth. But and these are also organizations that pride themselves as being cut off from any kind of political unit or any kind of political, you know, ideology, and they pride themselves on that because either they are, you know, people who were part of political trade unions and did not kind of, let's say, quote unquote, were benefited out of it and came out and created their own unions, or there were other reasons why, you know, they pride themselves for that. My only question is, how do we see the, you know, the functioning of these organizations in a long term, let's say, without them actively involving and putting efforts into political education and, you know, as you are also saying. So I was just trying to understand, how can we understand the longevity of such organizations when there is no active effort in trying to move away from, you know, at some point. I mean, I get that at a starting point this is important, but how do we then move away from that without, you know, actively putting efforts into political education and that kind of thing?
No, I must clarify here that all the unions of this study were putting their efforts into social mobilization and political education of workers, right? So for them, that was clearly a priority. What they were lamenting, what they were regretting was that they had to face competition from, let's say, these kind of fly-by-night NGOs, right? Not even very serious or committed NGOs, but really just individuals who set up some kind, they call themselves, you know, they're popularly called the letterpad union because that's all they do. They get that stamp for the worker and they manage to kind of be a mediator with the state bureaucracy, right? So those are the organizations, not even organizations. Like I said, those are just enterprising individuals who are looking for livelihoods and employment, right? And to be this kind of I mean, where you have such massive unemployment, this also becomes a kind of an enterprise, right? You just have to do something to, you know, whatever, to make an income. And you do that by having these contacts with the welfare boards. And then from what the worker pays you, you give a certain cut also to the welfare board officials, and then you retain something for yourself. These are the individuals who are not interested, who are purely in it as a livelihood activity, and who have no agenda or no understanding or no interest in any other kind of consciousness raising of workers, right? But they also happen to be competing with the unions of this study, all of whom were invested in a political agenda of political education of their workers. But like I said, I mean, it's also, as they said, what is we also have to be practical, no? What does political education really mean? To the women workers who are fruit sellers or flower sellers, it could mean that this union shows up, their union, right? Shows up saying, come tomorrow, there is a dharna, please come. And then, you know, the women might say, but look, how many dharnas do I show up for? Anyway, you say the same thing at every dharna, right? So there is also that. Also for all these informal sector workers, there is the need is the need of the everyday bread and butter, right? And the need also more than that. The need also being able to pay, they're all on the Tandal loans, right? These informal finance loans, which means they call it blade vatti, kand vatti, extremely high interest rates. So they have to make enough money by the end of the day, rush back, make sure that they make that payment to the money lender, to the financier. So, you know, life is really lived on the edge. So then their capacity also, their time, their resources, their availability for an agenda of political education also is something that we have to consider very seriously, right? So all of this is part of the story.
I just had a thought and a comment, and I thought if you could reflect on it, Professor Kalpana. It's very interesting that through the example and mobilization of informal sector women workers, that we sort of seek the coming together of agenda, the labor rights, and the women's rights issues sort of converging in these struggles. Otherwise, certain big city examples are also how collective action is happening in silos.
Right.
Whether it's the urban development agenda, that's sort of the forerunners are organizations or movements that are trying to stall evictions and improve basic communities. On the other hand, you have trade unions that are sort of bargaining or negotiating for labor rights issues. And then we have the women's rights organizations and movements that are trying to address questions of domestic violence and other forms of gender disparities that are sort of prevalent. So it's very interesting that through the example of the informal sector women workers and across different sort of groups, that you show us how these three can sort of be brought together and how they're so significant in a way to be brought together or thought together to improve the overall sort of lives and well-being of workers. So I found that very interesting and fascinating, because we keep talking about how struggles are fragmented and that we are sort of fighting these battles in silos. So just thought it was very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, there could be some silos also. I mean, the unions in my study also do not necessarily always join forces. They do sometimes, they don't at other times. So other kinds of silos also may continue to exist. Because there's also the question of um, remaining competitive. No, everybody feels that pressure to mobilize workers. And especially with the welfare boards, it's a trade union for them to recognize a trade union. Now, see, the other thing also that I should say is that it's really the welfare boards that are sort of deciding which kind of trade unions can be this intermediary, in some ways. Of course, they can't afford to ignore some of the big players, some of the established trade unions. But there is, I think, also a way in which the state and the state bureaucracy is also trying to, I won't use the word remote control. I don't want to make it sound like a conspiracy theory, but is also then trying to is playing a role necessarily, in labor movement mobilizing as well, right? And I think it does it perhaps the very arena of the welfare boards and the fact that all these unions have to get entangled with the bureaucracy to the extent to which they do, whether they like it or not, and whatever the consequences to them are of doing this. I think these are some of the more worrying signs as well, right? In terms of how are these unions going to be balancing these different struggles, the different needs of their workers. Sometimes they will have to be oppositional, they will have to be antagonistic, they will have to fight the state. But at other times, they will have to accommodate the state because they need the state to sanction, to endorse the welfare claim forms of their workers. Right? They can't completely afford to antagonize the state either. So how are they going to be striking? They're already doing that, right? They're already striking the balance. But the question is, what is the sustainability of that? How is that going to look in the future? We don't know that.
It's also very interesting vis-a-vis the state, the relationship is becoming this dual, at times in confrontation, at times in through negotiation. But it'd be interesting also to understand how they're doing this with employers, for example. Is it mostly in the nature of negotiation? Because scope for collective bargaining is also very limited in case of informal workers, especially if you have a very dispersed, say for instance, domestic workers kind of situation. How is this working at the level of the employers who are also fragmented?
At the level of the employers, I think it would be negotiation, perhaps not so much confrontation. I think it would be because that would be that's the nature of the workplace, the workforce also, right? It's the landscape there. So, for instance, with construction workers, often the contractors, many of the women workers are paid through contractors. Construction work, again, is heavily subcontracted, right? None of these workers exist on the payrolls of any of the companies, right? The big construction companies. So it's all the site engineers, below them, then there is the contractors, and then the contractors hire the workers. So in this case, then when women workers tend to be underpaid, that we already know that there is a wage disparity between, say, what a woman would make in a day and a male construction worker would make. But sometimes even that amount is not paid to a woman worker. Really, which is a woman after all, no? Why give her so much kind of thing? So then that's where the union steps. And the role of the union is to sort of negotiate with those contractors, but also kind of the presence of the threat, no, to let them know that she is not alone, that we are with her, right? We've got her back, kind of thing, right? So that's really the role that the union plays there, I should think. Yeah, so it's really more negotiation. And with the case of the middle class employers, it's the workers who negotiate with their employers, the training, the hand-holding, the support to do so, the solidarity in the local area among workers, that is provided by the union, but the union does not directly step in and negotiate with the employers. That's not their approach.
Hi, Kalpana, this is Sundar Babu here.
Hi, Sundar. I saw your name and I was so delighted.
Yeah. It was nice. Nice to hear all this. And small clarification. Did you come across during your study any discussion with regard to the role the gig economy would play? Like whether people are seeing it as a subversion or as an empowering thing, because slowly everything is being becoming invisible and being taken over. For example, even in domestic work, things like janitors and housekeeping, all becoming into gig sector. And also within construction, people are taking up painting and other work with this private sector. So was there any discussion, was there any reflection in the ground about this, how they are seeing it, the leadership and the people?
I didn't actually discuss that very much, Sundar. That also did not in this form appear as a issue. And it may have also been that perhaps I didn't think to probe this. It may have also been that. But one thing I did notice is that with the domestic workers, some of their sons were part of the gig economy, right? They were getting employed as Swiggy delivery, Zomato delivery, right? Some of their children, some of their sons in particular. And I didn't otherwise see any interface between the gig economy and the unions or the issues that they were raising that I can comment on in any useful way.
Okay, thanks.
Ma'am, just a small question.
Yes,
So,
Vignesh, please.
yeah, so the thing is that in one of the cases in Gujarat, a tribal lady from Rajasthan was recruited to a house in Ahmedabad as a domestic worker. So I don't know the scale in which these agencies are working in these metros and all that. So there was this wage theft case. So the thing was that the woman was actually not able to negotiate with the household the household. And the problem was that when she complained it to the house members, they said that is the agency that helps us make employees like you, so we can't just make a trade with them. So it's only the responsibility of the agency to pay back you your salary, so we can't do anything like that. So what's the scale at which these kind of agencies, if they're operating in Chennai, what's the kind of the unionization, the limitations to organization of these domestic workers in Chennai? I mean, have you come across any observations like that?
Yeah, there are these agencies that work in Chennai. That's not these unions though. And what those agencies do is to locate, is to find, basically to be that match. No, there are women who come to them saying that they are looking for employment, especially women who are coming from outside of Chennai, right? So they have to stay in somebody's homes and be a worker who resides in a home, right? And they sometimes as cooks, sometimes caring for children, or as providing some form of nursing care for the elderly. And there are very specialized agencies that cater to this, right? Some of them do only nursing kind of work, placing women in nursing roles. Some others do a larger variety of roles that includes cooking, cleaning work, etc. And of course, all these are Tamil women workers. To my knowledge, I don't think that they are necessarily working with women domestic workers from outside Tamil Nadu, right? The demand for this at least is for women from Tamil Nadu who approach these agencies, but they are by word of mouth, largely by word of mouth. Now, what the agencies do here is that they sort of negotiate a wage between the employer and the worker, and usually they have a wage in mind already, that if somebody stays and works, then it should be so much. If they do cooking also, it's so much. If it's only elderly care, it's so much kind of thing. And that's, I suppose, decided by the agency. I do know that, I mean, there can often be friction between these agencies and the women that they are placing in different homes. Not all agencies are sensitive to issues of, say, labor rights or gender rights. Once again, for many of these agencies, it's an employment, right? It's a livelihood. It's like a business, a small business that they do, which is to meet the demand for women domestic workers in various residential homes. They are not in the business of sensitizing either employers or organizing or unionizing the women who approach them. I must say that. But having said that, generally women who come through this route, I think they get paid more, right? Because the agencies tend to also negotiate a higher rate for them. Especially, it could also be because many of the women just stay overnight. No, they're 24/7 workers. So then they would be paid more than others who might be spending 3 to 4 hours or half a day or less than half a day, right? Because the dynamic here is somewhat different. So that's my sense of these agencies, Vignesh. I mean, I could be wrong, of course. There could be something which also combines it with a more rights-based perspective, but I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
Yeah, Anurag, if there are no other questions, should we conclude?
Yes, ma'am. There's nothing in the chat box, so I think we can.
No. I hope there are no other compelling questions from those who remain in the discussion. I think we once again profusely thank Kalpana for quite an inspiring presentation, and all those who asked, very, very interesting questions, which means that, we engage with the talk effectively. Thank you so much, Kalpana.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, all of you, for attending, for your questions, for listening, for your patience. Thank you so much. And
Thanks
thank
a
you for
lot.
the invitation, Tara. I'm so pleased to be part of
No,
this.
it was absolutely wonderful, Kalpana. Great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks to everybody. And we also expect you to kind of be part of our future such conversations. I'll also kind of, now you become a part of our mailing list, Kalpana. So you also
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
know that.
Sure, Tara. Sure, Tara.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.